This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, Will Carr heads to the dystopian future of Riddley Walker by Russell Hoban. His guide is writer and academic Graeme Wend-Walker. Set 2,000 years into the future, in an England still dealing with the fallout from nuclear Armageddon, Riddley Walker concerns the adventures of a 12-year-old as he discovers what lies outside his small community. The novel is narrated in an English that has degenerated over the years, so the reader discovers the world through a disorientating language. Burgess called the novel a permanent contribution to literature. Russell Hoban was born in Pennsylvania in 1925. At the age of 18, he served as a radio operator for the US Army during World War II. After leaving the Army, he made his name as an illustrator and an advertising copywriter. He began writing illustrated books for children in 1960. His first novel for adults was The Lion of Boaz Jachin and Jachin Boaz, published in 1973. He went on to write 15 more novels and more than 40 books for children. He died in 2011 in London. Graeme Wend-Walker is a creative writer and a professor of literature at Texas State University. His scholarship is focused on writing for children and young adults, as well as science fiction, fantasy, horror, and the folk traditions of Southeast Asia. His book, Russell Hoban, Faithful to the Strange, was published in 2025. For all the relevant links, head to the description of this episode, where you can also find a list of all the books mentioned. Here's Will Carr, who spoke to Graeme Wend-Walker about Riddley Walker by Russell Hoban in September 2025.
Welcome to another episode of the Anthony Burgess 99 Novels podcast. I'm delighted this time to be welcoming Graeme Wend-Walker to talk to me about Russell Hoban's fantastic dystopian novel, Riddley Walker. Welcome, Graeme.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Let's begin, perhaps not talking about Russell Hoban straight away, but maybe let's talk a little bit about you. It'd be really great for you to share with us how you first discovered Russell Hoban's work and maybe tell us a bit about what you made of it.
It was at university as an undergraduate. That was how I first encountered him, and it was Riddley Walker. It was on a reading list in a lit class, and I was absolutely enthralled by it from the get-go. I was a bit shocked, I suppose. I'd never read anything quite like it. I didn't know that you were, allowed to do this, break the rules the way this book does with language and so on. It seemed like a very punk thing to do, but at the same time, strangely deep and rich and mysterious. It seemed to be tapped into some kind of vital energy, and yet the setting is so dark and gloomy and filthy and wet and degraded. And there was a really wonderful tension between those two things. I think in my mind, I had a soundtrack that was somewhere between Still I Span and My Bloody Valentine, right? So the next thing was I looked Hoban up in the library and I found that he had written children's books too. And I found this book called How Tom Beat Captain Najork and His Hired Sportsman. And it's about a boy being raised by his maiden aunt, who's named Miss Fidget Wonkum Strong. And it says, she wore an iron hat and she took no nonsense from anyone. Where she walked, the flowers drooped, and when she sang, the trees all shivered. So she's like the anti-Orpheus. She's the enemy of creativity. But here's this boy, Tom, being raised by her, and he likes to fool around, and she cannot abide it. So she calls on Captain Najork and his hired sportsman, and the idea is that they will challenge Tom to various games, and they will defeat him and humble him and cow him into submission. But Tom is very good at these games, and he soundly defeats Captain Najork, and he goes off to find himself a new aunt. And I thought, well, there you have it. That's the spirit out of which Riddley Walker is written. There are no figs given for rules and conventions. It's a matter of what works and of taking joy in the play along the way. But Hoban clearly knows how to play these games, and he can do so on his own terms. He can color outside the lines, and he can do all this to triumphant effect. But it's all in service to, as I say, this deep sense of mystery, an unfathomable mystery, something that can't be comprehended by the Wonkum Strongs and the Najorks of the world. So I love the way this book seemed to ask for something from me as a reader. It seemed to ask for something like a silence before this mystery, which is why I should say I didn't want to write about Riddley Walker for this class. Subjecting it to analysis seemed to me to be a very Wonkum Strong thing to do. And for many years, I was happy to preserve Hoban's books from what I had come to think of as the Najorkian discursive complex. I wanted to keep them as a sort of private delight. But eventually I found myself applying to do a PhD, and I started to wonder, well, if I can't write about my favorite author, what's the good of all this? So there's got to be some way to do this. And I had to work out how to come at the work critically without wrecking it. And I did that. I worked something out. I came up with a way of doing it. And I've tried to practice criticism since then in this knowledge that I am necessarily a part of the Najorkian discursive complex. I am trying to impose some sort of discipline over the text. That's kind of my job. But I recognize that there is a Tom inside the text, and it is always going to defeat me. And I've come to feel that this is a good way of approaching not just Russell Hoban's books, but of practicing criticism in general. So those first impressions of Riddley Walker certainly have stayed with me. I don't think there's anything else I've ever read that had so profound and so immediate an impact on me.
That's amazing. It sounds like a really foundational text for you. And it's fascinating to hear about Hoban's other work, which, well, we'll perhaps talk about Hoban's legacy a bit later, but Riddley Walker is certainly his most famous and most popular or most read work available now. I wonder, for people who haven't actually read it though, perhaps you could just share with us a bit about the book itself. You described it in various ways, but I wonder if you could just introduce a reader who's perhaps not come across it before to the text. What could they expect to find in it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've got to be honest, I tend to hesitate when trying to describe Riddley Walker. I guess one of the things that we're often striving to do when we answer questions like this is to sort of sell the book to someone, try to interest them in reading it. And for the same reasons that I said before about not wanting to sort of contain and discipline the text as a critic, I also hesitate even to try to sell it to people. If I wanted to give a full kind of description, I would say that, okay, Riddley Walker is set in England, thousands of years after a nuclear holocaust. Humanity has been reduced to small settlements fenced against packs of wild dogs. They have no technology beyond bows and winches and pulleys, but they are haunted by this terrible knowledge that they once were something great, that they had boats in the air and pictures on the wind, is the phrase that's often quoted. They have a mythology to explain this, and it's pieced together from the tatters of their cultural remnants. An image from the legend of St. Eustace has somehow survived among the ruins of Canterbury Cathedral, with Eustace seeing Christ appearing before the antlers of a stag and subsequently seeing his children taken, on one riverbank by a wolf and the other on the opposite riverbank by a lion, while Eustace stands helplessly in the middle of the river. So in Riddley's world, this has morphed into a story about what we recognize as a story about the splitting of the little shining man the Addom, spelled Addom. So Ridley is a young man expected to take up his father's role, which is the role of connection man. And the job of a connection man is to interpret the presentations that are given by a touring government puppet show. The government is known as the mincery, which suggests ministry. This is, in both the governmental and ecclesiastical senses, because there is no separation of church and state in this world. And the connection man is supposed to interpret these puppet performances and turn them into pithy little proverbs for consumption by the community. But Ridley abandons this. He has an encounter with a wild dog that seems to want to tell him something. And so he climbs the fences and he heads out into the wilderness on this dangerous journey that will ultimately reveal to him the terrible truth, which is that humanity does not seem to be able to save itself, that barely having climbed out of the muck, it's already on the path to destroying itself again. So that would be one way of describing the book.
I appreciate you haven't wanted to sell it particularly, but it does sound fascinating. It's, it's in England, but not as we know it. It's language, but not quite as we know it. There's all these very complicated elements to do with, as you say, political systems and religious systems and all that kind of stuff. For me, as a relative novice to Riddley Walker, it's a real experience in world building. You kind of get completely drawn into it. And for me, a big part of that is Russell Hoban's use of language. Perhaps we'll come onto that in a moment. But first, I'd just like to touch on, one of the reasons that this book is contained in this series, because Anthony Burgess is very positive about Riddley Walker in his 99 novels selection. He describes it as a small masterpiece, and he says it's a permanent contribution to literature. That's his rhetoric there. But I wondered what you made of that quite grand assessment, really, and indeed what might be a good approach to take to what can be quite a challenging book to read. How would you go about accessing it for the first time?
Well, I mean, as you can probably tell, I think he's right. I do think it's a masterpiece. Is it a small masterpiece? I think that would be fair too, if by small we mean something that doesn't perhaps speak to a very broad literary readership. It's a little niche, perhaps. It's won quite a lot of acclaim, but it's not broadly acclaimed, as many masterpieces are. And, it has a kind of a smallness too in being, like so much of Hoban's writing, a very contemplative book. The hero of an earlier novel of Hoban's, Kleinzeit, is so named because he is a small-time hero. And we see this word Klein turning up throughout Hoban's writing, and even in Riddley Walker, which does speak to enormous questions. It shakes its fist at God and it weeps into the muck of our ruin, and there's this grand quest for meaning. Even this book returns us to a kind of smallness, the smallness of us individually before the forces of our individual and collective nature. So I don't think Hoban would object to small. There's a smallness is an enduring theme through his work, though I'm sure he would prefer if more people did read it and it were more broadly acclaimed. The idea of a permanent contribution to literature, I guess, is a part of what Burgess is seeing in it, and I'm certain of that too. You do occasionally. I've come across the odd critic who feels that the book is dated because it's written from out of the Cold War and it speaks to Cold War fears of nuclear annihilation. But I don't see that as in any way dating it. I mean, for one thing, I wouldn't be so cocky about that threat having passed. All the destructive possibilities are still on the table and they seem to be accumulating by the day. Margaret Drabble says of Riddley Walker that it's a book in which you can always find new meanings and new connections. And I think that's very true of this book. And I think that is what, in the end, makes for a classic. If you wanted to get a sense of Riddley Walker's permanent contribution, I would say actually look outside of literature. Just a few months ago, there was an exhibition. I didn't get to see it, but there was an exhibition by an American artist named Joey Monsoon. And it was of works inspired by Riddley Walker. And it was around the same time, this was early 2025, there was a group exhibition in East Sussex, I think, where 11 artists working in a variety of media were all responding to Riddley Walker. The novel's also inspired, and it continues to inspire, an extraordinary amount of music. Back in the late 80s, the British rock band King Swamp had a song called Widder's Dump, inspired by Riddley Walker. There's an experimental outfit called Current 93 that had a piece called In the Heart of the Wood and What I Found There, also from Riddley Walker. There is a song called The Rapture of Riddley Walker by the American hard rock band Clutch. A personal favourite of mine is Ode to Riddley Walker, which is a very folkish song that really captures the hauntingly elegiac feel of the novel, and that's by Diana Collier, formerly of the Owl Service, and that was from about 5 years ago. So these are just a few examples of songs recorded over a period of 3 decades. So I think it's as good a measure as any for a permanent contribution to literature that you have artists working in other media finding themselves compelled to pick up and refigure some part of Riddley Walker, and that's something that shows no sign of losing any steam. So absolutely, yeah, I would agree with Burgess's assessment there. I think the other part of the question was about how to approach it, about strategies for dealing with it. And you're right, it is a book that can present certain challenges to readers who are encountering it for the first time. I would say to readers who are new to it, just don't fight it. The language is a little bit difficult at first, and that is a whole subject in itself. But in short, though, I'd say I don't think it's that much of a challenge. I think most people do settle into it within a few pages. Occasionally, you might hit a phrase that you don't quite know what to do with. You can puzzle it out yourself, or you can look it up. There are later editions of the book have a glossary supplied by Russell Hoban. And I should mention there is an excellent website of Riddley Walker annotations that was put together by a fellow named Eli Bishop with a couple of dozen other contributors. If you just search for Riddley Walker annotations, you'll quickly find it. And there are excellent discussions there of what's going on in the language. And so looking that up and working those things out does add a level of richness to it that you might otherwise miss. But I don't think that any of that is critical to your reading of it. It doesn't matter if you don't work it all out. I freely admit that there are a couple of phrases in there that I still have not worked out. Most of what you see with the language is pretty straightforward, what we would call misspellings normally relative to standard English. But really, overall, so far as a strategy for approaching the book goes, I would say come at it like a literary blind date. Go into it with a willingness to let it be whatever it becomes for you, and it will certainly become something.
Yeah, my experience of reading the novel was that when things got a bit tricky, a bit unintelligible, it actually worked better as an oral text, as reading it out. Help make it immediately intelligible, actually, and perhaps a lot more enjoyable, and indeed quite a lot more funny in many ways. A lot of the jokes land as oral jokes rather than as visual jokes on the page. What that did do, though, was have the effect of slowing the reading of it right down, and so, to me at least, it felt that Hoban was making you spend more time in Riddler's world. He was making you live with him, these kind of slow-moving journeys that he makes across all the countryside. And I found that quite an interesting effect. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the language, about the kind of effects that it has. Other critics and perhaps you yourself have thought about it also in relation to Burgess's Clockwork Orange, and I wondered if you had any remarks to make about that.
Well, you're right. The language is tremendously important. And I like that point you make there about it. It has a visual dimension. There are certain things that you see when you read the language. It's a language that you want to hear. You really want to hear it spoken. And of course, this is one of the interesting options that readers have available to them. If they don't want to struggle with the written aspect of the language, you can listen to it as an audiobook. And then you get the full richness of the sound of it. And there are things that you will pick up that way, as you say. So it's very, very rich in regard to the language. And of course, there have been stage productions of it too. and in a stage production, you're not going to have the visual aspect of the words. You're not going to see some of the sort of the puns that are going on in the way words are written. And hopefully one day, I mean, I'm certain at some point somebody is going to make a film of this, and that will have there'll be the same issue there with language in that as well. But yeah, the language is tremendously important, and it's integral with the larger sense we have of the setting of this story. I mean, this is a picture of terrible bleakness. It's a world of mud and rain and perpetually overcast skies, and of perpetual danger the moment one steps outside of the fences. And you have, very few but the most basic comforts within the fences. And we come to understand that this is something that we did to ourselves, that we wrecked our world, we made the ground sour, and it's what we now have to live in. And part of the terrible sadness of it all is that these poor communities are being directed by the government to dig up out of this rotten earth any remnants they can find of the past. So they're digging up heavy old machinery without any understanding of what it is. And the hope is that the government hopes that they'll be able to tap into, they'll be able to recover some of the knowledge of the old world and of what created all of these machines. But really, it's a constant salt in the wound of this knowledge they have, that they just don't get it. They know that once humanity was something else, and they cannot begin to grasp what it was. In the opening pages, in fact, Ridley's father is killed when one of these pieces of machinery, which they've been trying to hoist out of the earth, falls on him and crushes him. And it's a really powerful and tragic metaphor, that the hunger for a future power predicated on a past power that has already destroyed them will crush them again. And so it's a most potent experience of profound hopelessness, although there is, at the end, there is some glimmer of hope that emerges out of it. And that's a running theme through the book. The idea of, the hope of a tree, an allusion, of course, to Job, though they have no recollection of Job. For there is hope for a tree, if it is cut down, that it will sprout again, and that its tender shoots will not cease. So Ridley spends most of the novel in the literal and figurative wilderness, scrounging for understanding, and by the end, some qualified sense of hope has emerged from this. So coming back to the question about the language, it's absolutely of a piece with that. The setting and the language, in a sense, are one thing. The physical world has been smashed to bits, and knowledge has been lost, and they're trying to dredge remnants of it up from the mud. And the language is more or less the same. They have scraps of language. It's as if language has been blasted to bits too. And as with the old machines, they misunderstand what it is that the scraps of it that have come down to them. But I have to qualify that. I have to say I say misunderstand. I'm using that word in inverted commas because it's not really correct. They do misunderstand English as we know it, and there's quite a lot of humor that comes out of that. But these, again, in inverted commas, misunderstandings really speak volumes about what this culture has to say about itself. And in that sense, they're not misunderstandings at all. I mean, obviously, you can say the same thing about modern English. I'm sure people from a couple of hundred years ago would look at the way we are using their words and phrases and say, no, you've completely misunderstood that. You've bastardized it and wrecked it, and you've lost all of the meaning out of it. And in a sense, they might have a point, but we would say, well, yes, but we're using language to reflect what it is that we have to say about ourselves. So in that sense, in Riddley Walker, Hoban is giving us a language that is very, very alive in this world of rot. It's sodden and corrupted, but it's also the hope of a tree. The language is growing side by side with human understanding, and Ridley, who is first and foremost a storyteller, a narrative artist, and that's certainly what we see him becoming at the end of the book. He's the connection man who is making connections for us through language that help to grow his and our understanding, in part by undercutting official investments in language arts. So this is a story that is very aware of language. So in a very qualified sense, we can say that the language is broken, but it's also not at all. It's a very living language that Hoban means for us to take every bit as seriously as we take our own, and perhaps even more seriously, because it has this defamiliarizing effect where it's applying pressure to our language and revealing things in it that we might have stopped noticing. Perhaps I can use an example. So there's one scene in the book where a dead man is found in a boat at the shore. And there is speculation that he might be a faring secret trier from the other side. So we have this word faring, which we can take to mean far traveling. Far has become a verb, giving us the participle faring. But of course, far is related to the word fare, as in seafaring. So with faring, Hoban is really just calling up something that is already there in the language and re-foregrounding this association with distance, which results in something that feels both new and old at once. And that's what the whole world of Ridley is. This is a world in which everything new is old again. So then you have secret, which suggests seeking. It suggests secret. And it also suggests the sea. Secret is spelt S-E-A. So a seeker of secret knowledge from over the seas. And then you have trier. So a seafaring trier after secret knowledge from afar. But of course, at the same time, faring secret trier is a corruption of foreign secretary. Right. So you can read this perhaps as a naive romanticization of the idea of a foreign secretary. There's also a suggestion perhaps that maybe the world really would be a better place if governments actually employed faring secret triers, or if foreign secretaries viewed their role in these terms. But pulling against that, you also have, of course, in the word secret and the suggestion of secrets, the idea that a foreign secretary might really be a glorified spy. So there are a lot of things going on in that phrase, and you can't neatly resolve them all, which is tremendously good fun. So again, to think of this as merely as corrupted language, I think really, really misses it. All of our reality, this novel is constantly reminding us, exists on the stage that is set by our language. We think our world through the language we have to think it with. And that's why I think there has been so much critical attention to the use of language in this story, because it is so integral to everything that's happening in it. Hoban is giving us this, again, in inverted commas, corrupted English that shows how far we've fallen. But at the same time, he's making it new and responsive, and he's breathing light into it and giving it to us as a kind of prism through which to look at how our thinking about ourselves is constructed and how else it might be constructed. He's defamiliarizing it, and there's a wonderful freshness in the language because of that. So, so far as the reader is concerned, as I say, most readers slip into it quite comfortably within a few pages, and it really doesn't take long before it becomes a lot of fun. You said before something about the language slowing us down, and that really is, I think, is part of the point of it. And in fact, Hoban has said that part of the point of the language, as he sees it, is to slow the reader down to Ridley's rate of perception. That's how he puts it. Yeah, it's a really important part of the text, and you need to just go with it and play with it and allow that you might not understand all of it, because not all of it, can be pinned down anyway, no matter how much you analyze it. And as I said before, there's always, audiobooks if people want to come at the language that way. It does sound pretty great when it's being read with a kind of thick Kentish accent.
Yes, I imagine it does. There was a really fascinating example, actually, that you pulled out there from just 3 words. It really demonstrates some of the richness of the text. And one of the things it says to me is that we know Riddley Walker's language already. It's a language that we already speak. All of these ideas, all of these connections and so on are contained within our language. It's just that we might not necessarily notice that all the time. And one of the effects that the text has is to draw those out. I don't know if we should talk about Clockwork Orange or not, but because the experience of Nadsat in Clockwork Orange, for me at least, is quite different, in that the experience of reading that text is that you are learning anew a new language, if I can use that word to describe Nadsat, that by the end of the novel, you're comfortable reading in this new way, with this new vocabulary, with these new connections, new sentence structures, new connections between words. Whereas what's going on in Riddley Walker is quite different, in my view anyway. As I say, I feel like this is language that we already have, that we already know as English readers. But one of the things that Hoban does is send us back to some of the hidden meanings contained within it. I wondered if you had any reflections perhaps on Nadsat as it compares to Riddley Walker.
Yeah, and I would agree with everything you just said there. It's interesting that Clockwork Orange and Riddley Walker are so often compared, because in both cases you do have this sort of this invented dialect. But I agree with you. I think they're doing very different things. For one thing, in A Clockwork Orange, it's not, you don't have an entire novel written in Nadsat. It's a dialect that exists within the narrative, and it's an extremely important part of it. But we recognize it as a distinct sociolect, and one that has been constructed in part as a way of resisting the mainstream. So we are positioned outside of the text, and we do, as you say, we have to learn it. And the most difficult part of that really is just learning vocabulary. Otherwise, the English of Nadsat, it uses some unconventional grammatical constructions, but it's not particularly difficult for the reader to get their heads around it, once we've got a bit of a grasp of the vocabulary. But Ridley speak, as it's often referred to, is essentially the medium through which we are encountering the entirety of this novel. That's a significant difference. It's less about, I think, an evolved, consistent dialect than it is about, as you say, it's a constant opportunity for word games and for punning and skewed rhyming and so on. There's a very high degree of internal consistency within it, but there's a playfulness along the way. And it's about using language to constantly prompt us into thinking about what Ridley is encountering. And that's not the same thing that Nadsat is doing. Whereas I say it has a distinct kind of political function within the world of A Clockwork Orange, rather than being the medium of that entire world. So yeah, I agree with you. I think there's some big overlaps between the two, but they're serving very different functions in the stories.
Let's move on perhaps to think about how people have read Riddley Walker in terms of its themes. We've not spoken very much about that, though you touched on some of them already. There are readings that look at the way in which myth and religion is used in the novel, for example, or the environmental themes, particularly the kind of post-nuclear kind of environment that is depicted in Riddley Walker. I wondered if there are any interpretive approaches that particularly resonated with you, or readings that you felt were particularly fruitful for people approaching the text.
Yeah, it's a good question, because this is a novel that lends itself to being read through so many different critical lenses. And all of the ones that you mentioned, yes, they all resonate for me. They're all helpful. If I were to favor one approach over any other, though, I think it would be an approach through, I have to put this in inverted commas too, but through a religious lens. There are a lot of reasons, I think, why that doesn't necessarily jump to the fore for some readers, which is part of the reason why I would encourage people to think about it. Religion is thought by many people now as inherently conservative, and it's more exciting for some readers to approach what Hoban is doing here in terms of a sort of a progressive critique of structures of power and so on, and it certainly is that. But this novel is also, you could say, kind of post-structuralist in its critique of the social construction of the categories religious and secular and progressive and conservative. Something that the novel is constantly doing is prompting us to ask what happens when certain kinds of progressivism, for instance, become dogmatic, or what happens when conservatism radically subverts one's sense of reality. It's deeply skeptical about the way these categories are aligned. And you find, for instance, multiple points in the narrative where we have to seriously rethink certain key figures, Listener, Goodparley, and Orphing in particular. We're constantly guided toward a radical deconstruction of our own tribal alignments.
They're characters in the novel, just
right, and the roles that they have and the sorts of feelings that we tend to develop towards them when they're first introduced to us always end up seeming to have to be questioned later on. So the situation in the story is deeply political when viewed up close. It's all about the machinations of the government and the way power is used to accumulate more power and so on. But as Ridley comes to see things through a longer lens, other ways of knowing begin to move to the fore, and they displace the kinds of sociological analysis that we might usually want to apply. And it's interesting that if you look at the sorts of things Hoban was saying in interviews all through the early 1980s, when this book was attracting a lot of attention in the press, he's pretty consistent about this word religious. He says quite emphatically that he felt that what he was doing in writing this book was essentially engaging in what he called a kind of religious action. So it not only is the meaning in the book, so far as he's concerned, religious, it was a religious labor to produce it. And he does back off from that at a point. He says that he's not sure if he has the right to call it religious, and he suggests that perhaps all real artistic engagement with its material is in some sense religious, even that art is not fundamentally different from religion. And that's certainly what we see with Ridley at the end, where he's setting out to tell stories with his Punch and Judy fit up, and we see he's breaking through a sort of a religious mold into what you could think of as a more secular artist mold. So there is a deconstruction of the idea of the religious going on, a questioning of where the religion begins and where it lets off. And in fact, it's very easy to read the book as post-religion. Humanity, as we say, has been nearly destroyed, and which means, no God stepped in to save us. The Christian church has been completely forgotten, and even that one surviving remnant, the story of St. Eustace from Canterbury Cathedral, has become completely reinterpreted as this mythologized telling of the story of the splitting of the atom. It bears no connection to anything recognizably Christian anymore. And as I say, by the end of the novel, what is essentially a state religion is being displaced by Ridley by something that looks a lot more like art. But still, we have Hoban consistently using this word religious to describe what it is that he's doing. And I talked at the beginning about this not wanting to reduce things, not wanting to put things into neat little boxes with labels on them, which is what we often do as critics. And it's not that it's necessarily wrong to intellectualize about this book. There are lots of ways we can very fruitfully do that. But Hoban's primary concern for himself in writing it is clearly something else. And it all hinges on this idea that intellectualizing doesn't capture everything that we need to understand. It's very seductive, the idea that you can contain things in words, that you can pin the truth down and make it sit still for you. But the trouble is, as Hoban sees it, is that this leads us away from other kinds of knowing, which are perhaps even more important. As Ridley says, sometimes there's more in the empty paper nor there is when you get the writing down on it. So there's this resistance coming from Hoban himself toward wanting to contain things in language. And that's why the language is also, why it's so slippery in this book, because there is this resistance to excessively codifying things. So what Hoban is after is this sense of there being another kind of knowledge and another way of knowing that is vitally important. It's vitally important to our future as a species, but it's not something that we can expect to be able to contain in language, because the effort to contain things in language is another part of that same problem that ultimately results in our destruction. So he's extremely wary of that. And of course, some people don't have much patience for this kind of thinking, this sort of the reaching after the ineffable. And other people might say, well, yes, of course, language constructs our sense of reality rather than revealing it, and so on. And I think that Hoban's response to that first group, in effect, is to explore this problem within a world that is grim and threatening, and where survival at both the individual level and as a species ultimately may depend on this capacity to see through to a larger perhaps unspeakable truth. And to the second group, he'd say, I think, well, yes, but you're still intellectualizing it. It's one thing to appreciate intellectually how language constructs reality, but it's quite another thing to actually let go enough that you can allow your own investment in the construction of reality to dissolve a little. And again, I think that's what we see happening through his use of language. All of the clever punning and this capacity words and phrases have to point in different directions at once. It prompts us to let go. And that's why we need to slow down and get into Ridley's state of perception, where things don't signify in neat and tidy and convenient ways. And so I think that's the sort of thing that Hoban is talking about when he uses this word religious. And I think it's the sort of approach that he would like us as readers to take to it, that he would like us to slow down to Ridley's rate of perception and not be in too much of a hurry to make sense of things. In fact, he is explicit at one point in an interview in talking about the use of language as, in part, intentionally creating a certain difficulty for the reader that is designed to achieve this effect. He calls it the price of admission. It's a kind of the difficulty that we first encounter is something like a ritual threshold that we have to pass through if we want to enter into the space of the text. So what does he mean by religion? Well, it's a very Gnostic kind of religion that he has in mind. It's a apophatic kind of religiosity where, we're more concerned with rejecting what we think we know so as to create a space within which we might be open to perceiving that which eludes our conventional limited ways of knowing. It's a relationship of first knowing. It's a relationship of immediacy and of not separating oneself from that source through the impulse to possess or contain or extract value from it. I'm pretty sure there's some influence from Zen Buddhism in there too. That was something that Hoban, I know, was reading a lot of at the time. So yeah, that's perhaps a long answer, but I would encourage readers to think about that. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Graeme. And there's a tremendous amount to conjure with there, absolutely. And I think readers would find that kind of approach very illuminating. Let's move on a little bit, though, perhaps to thinking about where the novel is now and where it relates to other works. It's often thought of as it is a dystopia, I suppose. So it's put alongside some of the dystopias we've already mentioned. I wondered if, thinking perhaps beyond the visual artists and musicians that you mentioned already, whether there are any literary artists who spring to mind as having been particularly influenced by Hoban. And I wondered what you thought Riddley Walker and indeed Russell Hoban, where they were today in terms of readership and perception and so on. What's their current state?
Well, one I should mention, this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but a number of people have pointed out that Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome appears to have pilfered quite a lot from Riddley Walker without acknowledging it.
Well, there's a certain scene in it, isn't there, where they a kind of cargo cult, where there's the children in the wilderness.
Yeah, and a Mr. Walker, and yeah, there's quite a lot.
Yeah, you don't seem convinced.
My understanding is that there had actually been a meeting between Hoban and George Miller, and there had been some talk about the possibility of an adaptation of Riddley Walker, but that didn't happen. And instead, what happened was Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. So it's not just coincidence. In terms of more specific influences, there are a few authors who have explicitly acknowledged Hoban's influence on them. Will Self, David Mitchell, Patrick Ness are all very enthusiastic about Russell Hoban and his influence on their work is something they happily acknowledge. There are other authors, Ian Banks with Fearsome Engine. A lot of people have made that connection. Hoban is something of a writer's writer, I think. There are probably innumerable authors who have taken something from Riddley Walker, though it might not always be evident. And in fact, actually, just in the last few weeks, I've seen a couple of book reviews making comparisons with Riddley Walker, and they're very different kinds of books. One of them was Catabasis, a new book by R.F. Kuang. And then just more recently, there was the new Ian McEwan book, What We Can Know. And in both cases, there were reviewers making connections to Riddley Walker. And I haven't had a chance to read either of these books yet, so I can't tell you how Ridley-esque they actually are. But I think it really says something that Ridley has become such a touchstone that it turns up in all kinds of places. So it's very hard to trace influences from Hoban. And I don't really think that there is anyone out there who is actually writing like him. He really is one of a kind. But I don't doubt that there are, as I say, innumerable authors who have picked up some kind of a feeling from his work, or some sort of an impulse, or some sort of, I don't know, some quirkiness. But I can't name a single person who I would say is, yes, that's like Russell Hoban.
Well, all the more reason for us to go back to the source ourselves. Well, I wondered if we could finish then by asking about another novel, but a novel of your choice, really. So Burgess picked 99 novels for his selection, and so we're asking everyone joining in this project to pick 100th to add to his list. Is there anything that you would select?
Yes. Well, look, I know Burgess had a few authors appearing more than once on his list, so I think I'm allowed to nominate another Russell Hoban book. If I were to do that, I would go with, I think, Turtle Diary. This was his novel just before Riddley Walker. I say just before, there's 5 years between them because it took that long to write Riddley Walker. It's one of very few novels he wrote that has no really, overtly fantastical element in it. It's about a pair of neurotic Londoners trying to decide whether they should free some green sea turtles from the London Zoo, and worrying themselves over what it would mean if they did or if they didn't. It's the Hoban book I most often come back to, aside from Ridley. I don't know what Burgess would have said about it, but I do think everyone should read it. If I were to pick someone other than Hoban, I would also want to double up there with Chinua Achebe. I think it was a man of the people that Burgess put on his list. I would nominate the earlier Things Fall Apart, partly because, like Riddley Walker, it had a profound, even devastating effect on me when I encountered it as an undergraduate. And as with Ridley, every rereading of that book since then has reconfirmed its value to me. I think every syllable of that book is perfectly judged. So either of those, I think, would be a worthy addition to the list.
Fantastic. Thank you, Graeme. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about Riddley Walker and Russell Hoban, and indeed everything else. I understand your own work on Hoban is being published soon. Is that correct?
No, apparently my box of author copies is arriving tomorrow, which is pretty exciting. And the official publication date is 8 days from now. So maybe I can plug that. It's called Russell Hoban, Faithful to the Strange. And it's a critical approach to his work as a whole. I've tried to look at the children's books, the adult novels, all of it together, and trying to be conscious throughout of the fact that I am participating in the Nagorkian discursive context. I'm also working, maybe I could mention, I'm working on a biography of him now too. So that's shaping up to be a lot of fun.
Fantastic. Well, that's great to know about, and yeah, biography as well. Thank you once again, Graeme. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Russell Hoban, Faithful to the Strange by Graeme Wend-Walker is out now. For more information about Anthony Burgess and the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can subscribe to the Burgess Foundation's free weekly newsletter at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com.